to another episode of Truth and Legacy. I'm your host, Legacy of Dawkins, and today I wanted us to talk about taxes. Taxes for entrepreneurs, taxes for creatives, and taxes for everyday person, everyday civilian that may need to know a little bit more. And why not bring someone that knows taxes? So I have my good friend here today, Rudy Pean, a tax professional. We just wanted to break down and just talk about the pros and cons of taxes, the ins and outs, the do's and don'ts. Just little tips for you guys and for me as well too, because I'm going to be learning as well what you need to do, the logistic side of your business and how to be a creative. So without further ado, Rudy Pean.
Man, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you, my brother.
Yes, man. Definitely, man. Definitely want to give it back to you, man.
Yeah.
Known you for years. I appreciate the invitation. Watching you, your growth, your business, your brand is beautiful. And so those that are tuning in, this is a very, very important segment for you guys. Those that are looking to go independent, be artists, or maybe balance a full-time job and a side gig, I think we're going to touch some good talking points here. So I appreciate you for having me.
What got you into being a tax professional or just into the tax business?
Yeah, it's an interesting story I love sharing because, at our moments that we're lost is kind of where we actually find ourselves. And so, long story short, I'm getting my bachelor's degree. I'm finishing up what's called a capstone class, pretty much my last class before I graduate. And my oldest brother, Chris, calls me up and he's like, hey, look, man, I'm going to start a tax business and I'm looking for an office manager. And I'm like, I have no job. I'm going to graduate in a couple weeks. You're telling me you're going to pay me every single week and you're going to pay me to learn the practice. I said, sign me up. And so I ended up moving back from Boston, moved to Florida. He sent me to Tampa. I took a weekend course, and then we ended up opening up a tax practice together. And so I think the genius in me staying in the business long was that I positioned the tax office near a barbershop. And so I had a great relationship with that business owner. And so things went great the first year. I was able to hire my own staff, train them, market them. But like anything you do in life, it's always a learning curve. And so things went well, but not well enough for us to maintain that office location. And so we ended up closing the storefront down. But then my barber would call me and he was like, hey, look, people are asking for you for their taxes. And I said, really? He's like, yeah, man, they're looking for the tax guy. And he's like, can I share your number with them? I said, yeah, go ahead. And so what ended up happening was I ended up maintaining relationships with some of our first year clients. And so I was able to service them the next year. And then I partnered up with somebody else for another 2 years. Things didn't work out with us, but it was a great opportunity to learn business in the real world. And so there's only so much you can learn in the classroom, but stepping out of your comfort zone and really going out there and marketing your brand and your business was great for me. And so I go home, complain to my wife, and God bless her. She was like, babe, instead of complaining about it, why don't you just start your own business? And I said, wow, that's interesting. Yeah. And so I was working a full-time job at the time, and it just so happened that I had somebody I can call on to give me the back end of the business. And so with that being said, I went full throttle, LLC, branding, marketing. And so you fast forward, 10 years in the industry, 7 years independent, just from a simple phone call. Wow. And so I'm very appreciative of those that came in front of me as mentors to put me in a position to where now we're really helping clients, nationwide.
Let's go. 7 years in the business.
Yeah, man.
Oh,
yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. So tell me, what's one truth about money or taxes that changed your life since you've been in the business for 7 years?
Yeah, it's interesting because, we work so hard. This concept of the money is the answer for most of our problems is really not. Money is fluid. And so when I say that is, once you have the revenue, it's really, really, really important to, especially as a business owner, to reinvest it back in your business. Yeah. One of those things that people think about is like, man, if I get enough money, I can do this, I can do that. But it takes a discipline. And I think that was one of the biggest things I learned as I was growing my brand, growing, the business is like I started making money and I wasn't really used to that. And then so it came to where, how do I manage my money to not only pay for my personal bills, but to also reinvest it in my business? And there was times where I didn't trust the money to be fluid. And so I would just hold on to it. But then it didn't do anything for me. And so when I understood the concept of just that investing in the business and understanding, that holding on to the money is not going to be a beneficial thing for you. It's what you do with the money and investing it, I think, is really what I've learned over the years.
Welcome, everyone, to the greatest game show this side of the IRS. Tax win or tax sin. Let's play.
I got a question. Does buying food every day for lunch, is it like a business meal?
So we're always looking to save money when it comes to being an entrepreneur. So think about it this way: when you go out to lunch or dinner, you can. So that's definitely a tax win. But here's the way you win. When you go out to lunch or dinner with a potential client or a business partner, and you guys are talking about business, if over 50% of the conversation is based on business, future endeavors, then whoever pays for that bill, or if it's split, make sure you document who you're with, what you guys spoke about, and you can write it off on your taxes. That is definitely a tax win.
How do you use your work to help people build a legacy, not just getting a refund check?
Yeah, when it comes to taxes, you're dealing with so many different aspects of people's personal life.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I tell my clients initially is that, this is going to be the biggest check that you're going to get throughout the year. And so it's very, very important to lay down some roots, whether that's some sort of investment, a high yielding savings account, maybe they're pursuing buying a home. A lot of my clients, sometimes, unfortunately, they might be in a situation where they've got some type of, medical bill, high credit card, something like that. And so we really do a deep dive into what's the next steps, not only for this potential refund, but also setting yourself up long-term for, the tax season next year. So a lot of different aspects go into it, but one of the biggest things I tell clients to do is, again, it comes down to managing that money. What's really important to you now? What can you sow seeds in currently that are going to be fruitful for you long-term? Especially my clients that are, really young, just had their first child, and they're getting that big refund check with a dependent. They don't know what the next steps are. And so for me, I don't really try to give them too much in regards to financial advice, but just more basic money managing principles to kind of live by. One thing that we mainly focus on with the firm is that, we're always readily available to clients. And so we're not one of those companies where it's like, hey, you just file your taxes and we'll see you next year. I'm always readily available to my clients. So these conversations are always consistently happening, especially with those clients that kind of transition either from one employer to another or may get married, for example. Their tax situation changes. So it's always a conversation that's consistently happening throughout the year.
Back for another round? Let's do it.
Hey, as a videographer, I'm curious, with all this camera equipment that I purchased, is it really a write-off? Is that something that I can actually do?
Most deductions and write-offs are essentially based on your specific business that you're in. A percentage usage of that you can write off. So just make sure you keep proper documentation of all of your expenses and your receipts. So that definitely is a tax win.
What's some common mistakes that some entrepreneurs or creatives can avoid when getting into the tax season or when, starting their business in LLCs?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so when it comes to independent contractors or self-employed people for taxes, one of the biggest things that we always struggle with, especially with new clients, is having proper documentation in order. And so the easy way to understand that is if you're a W-2 employee, your employer keeps track of your income and you're automatically paying federal taxes. Well, self-employed is a little bit different. See, you're responsible to track your revenue for the business. And so the way it works is when it comes to tax filing is your total revenue for that year minus your expenses. And when it comes to those expenses, they've got to be categorized. And essentially all that means is we have to have the name of that expense. So it could be in a case where it's a creative space. It could be your lighting, your camera, maybe your microphone, different brand things that you invest in, and that total amount of that expense. And so that's one of the biggest hurdles initially when we onboard a new business is kind of getting them organized. And then once we have them organized in some type of document tracking, easiest one to know is like QuickBooks. From there, their business is now sustainable long term when it comes to fully understanding what the numbers look like every single month. And then more importantly, that potential tax bill they may have at the end of the year. So that's kind of one of the things that we always see, and we try to make sure we fix that on that first initial call with them.
What is the difference between a CPA and just a tax provider?
Yeah.
Tax professional.
Yeah. So, the biggest thing obviously is a licensing. So there's a licensing requirement when it comes to CPAs. Most CPAs will go to school for like some type of finance degree. But the biggest one is that a CPA can represent a client in court. And so all that means is, like, let's just say somebody's either filing bankruptcy, or there's somebody that's, they're married and the spouse happens to be deceased and you're trying to figure out assets. A CPA can represent you in court. A tax professional like myself can do that as well. We would have a client maybe sign like a power of attorney, for example, and that'll allow us to talk some basics with the court systems. But we do everything a CPA firm can do in regards to tax filing processes. So we do, S corps, C corps, partnerships, non-for-profits, and obviously your personal taxes with those people that have like W-2s. So that's kind of the biggest difference. But I think, with us, our competitiveness compared to CPAs is like we don't do hourly rates. A lot of CPAs do that. When we'll get a phone call, a lot of CPAs will charge you for a basic phone call. We'll talk to a client, essentially for free to kind of gauge them. So there are pros and cons to it, but essentially there's not much a CPA can't do that we don't.
You can do.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. So what is tax evasion?
Yeah, so a lot of people, they'll be nervous. Like, I'll get a phone call from a client and they'll be like, man, you know what? I haven't filed my taxes in years. I don't want to go to jail. I need help. So that's tax evasion. Tax evasion is making the money and not filing your taxes. A lot of people like in the film industry get caught up in stuff like that. A lot of people that are performers, your artists, they'll get caught up in making so much money, like on the road, for example, with tours and all that. And so they'll make the money and then they won't file the proper documentation in regards to their taxes. So that's tax evasion. Tax evasion is making money and not filing taxes. Now, tax filing and having like a IRS bill is different from tax evasion. So that's actually making the money as like either self-employed or maybe W-2, and then not paying enough in federal taxes, and so they have a tax bill. That's very important because you either have to get on a payment plan if you can't pay the full balance. You want to get on a payment plan with the IRS, and they'll do some type of income-based payment plan for you, or they'll give you like a 6 months to a year to pay that tax bill down. But that's the biggest difference, is one is literally making the money and not filing taxes for many, many years. And one is getting caught up on your taxes or filing your taxes and potentially having some type of tax bill. I mean, you always want to pay your tax bill because they can put a lien on your property or they can start garnishing some of your wages.
Gotcha.
And you really don't want
that.
No, you don't want that at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I include if you have a family and everything.
Oh man,
garnishing your wages.
Yeah. It gets messy. It gets real messy. So, a lot of people, they'll get like a tax notice and they'll just avoid it. They'll just say, I'll just put it aside. I'll deal with it later. And what happens is when you have a bill with the IRS, that accrues penalties and interest. And so you can have a simple tax bill of like $1,000 and you put it aside for X amount of months, man, it could balloon up to extra, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's very important to, if you get a tax notice in the mail from the IRS, if you don't fully understand what it's saying, get with a tax professional or just call the IRS and ask questions that you don't know.
Right.
And so that's what they're there for, to service us.
So how early do you feel like we need to prepare for taxes? And what does that look like?
Yeah, again, that's one of those twofold answers. So if you're a fully independent person and you're self-employed, and so you have no job but your business, you want to make sure every single month, whether you have a bookkeeper or you do it yourself, you do what's called reconciling your books. And all that means is to look at your monthly total revenue for that month and your expenses, and then see what your net profits are. And so usually about 25% of that net profit is your tax bill. So as a self-employed, fully independent person, you really want to look at your books every single month.
Okay.
As a W-2 employee, those taxes come out of your paycheck every single week or every 2 weeks. And so it's very important to look at the tax table online and look at what your current income is and project out what it will look like for the year.
Okay.
And so those are usually really good to do every quarter. So every 4 months, if you're a W-2 person, just log into whatever paycheck processing your company uses, take a look at your last paycheck stub, and then it can tell you your yearly gross. It'll be like, it's called YTD, which is like your year-to-date income.
Okay.
And then you take a look at that, and then for whatever reason, if your income is a little bit higher, then you might want to update your W-4 tax form with your employer and make sure enough taxes are coming out based on the potential filing status you're going to be at the end of the year. And just a quick note on the filing statuses. The different filing statuses are single. You know, if you're a single person, no dependents. If you're head of household, to be head of household, it'd be yourself, and then you have a dependent. And then married filing joint if you're married, and you and your spouse would claim your taxes together. Married filing separate, for whatever reason you're going through some type of separation with your spouse. You each would be filing married filing separate. And then a widower, if you happen to lose a spouse, then you'd be following as a widower. So that's different filing statuses.
Gotcha. So if someone has never worked with a tax professional before, what are some things that they should be looking for in a tax professional to know that this is a valid person?
Yeah. So the biggest thing you want to look at is what's called a P10. And a P10, P-T-I-N, is a series of numbers that you would get as a tax professional on your application to actually prepare taxes legally. And so you want to make sure that that person has a P10 and they're registered with the P10 directory. And so from there, you can look at their basic credentials, and that'll make you know that, hey, this person is legit. And then you can take it a step further and see if they've done any type of continuing education credits. If they still claim that they are the business owner, depending on what state you're in, you can always look up their information online. But the biggest thing is a P10, making sure they can actually prepare returns per IRS approval.
Gotcha.
And so that's an application that is required by the IRS every single year. And so you want to make sure that person's P10 is always active for that tax year.
All right, last one for today.
Hey, I was wondering, I have a child and I would really like to have my sister claim her on her taxes. She makes more money than me. Do you think that's possible?
So it's very important that when you're filing your taxes and you're looking to get those credits, you've got to make sure that you fully qualify for it. So if you are not the legal guardian of that child, you cannot claim them on your taxes. That is a tax sin.
See you next time on Tax Win or Tax Sin. You guys played very well.
What's one thing that young Black entrepreneurs should know about taxes or should just even know about financial power?
I think the biggest thing, and this is not just for entrepreneurs, but for people of color or minorities.
Yeah.
So we have the biggest spending as consumers. And so a lot of times when we get the money, we just go back out there as a consumer. We have to have the realization that we have to stop being the consumer first and be mindfully ready to invest. I think the biggest shift I had when it came to growing the business is when I really learned how to reinvest my money back into the business. You know, we find ourselves in this rat race where it's like we get paid and we're going to pay our bills. Whatever's left over, we're going to go and do something. You know, and we find it more important to go out either to the club or get VIP,
Or go on vacation.
vacations that we're not ready for.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest thing that we as a minority group, especially with the spending capacity that we do,
Right.
is that it's very, very important that we look to reinvest in our business. Even if you're not a business owner and you say, well, look, I don't have a business to invest in, what else should I do? Well, the biggest investment you can do is on yourself.
Okay.
And so a lot of times we have to be willing to pay for the information. Not everything is free. And so if you're somebody that's working a full-time job, and you've thought about getting into either some type of side business, starting your own business, it's okay to take some money and invest in the knowledge. And it's so interesting because a lot of us will go to school, we'll go to college, and we'll invest in these universities and institutions, and then we'll graduate and we'll be like, man, I don't have a job, or I graduate with student loans. And so we're so easily willing to invest in universities that probably won't guarantee us a job, but maybe investing in some type of mentorship program. We're always hesitant to do that. Now you have to be mindful and do your due diligence with different, mentorship programs.
Right.
But at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing is the willingness to invest in ourselves or in our brand. I think we lose that in our society, And so, yeah, you got the bag, worked hard, but do you really need a name brand?
Right.
Or is it more important to go educate yourself on something you don't know? And so I think that's the biggest shift that I made. And it's really helped me a lot with the growth of the business.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I always encourage people to do.
Yeah, I like that. Next question. What is the power of networking and how has it benefited you being in this field that you're in right now?
Yeah, man, networking is huge. The biggest hurdle that people have to overcome if they ever want to become an entrepreneur is understanding that you have to have a willingness to have a conversation with somebody you don't know. And so you have to get out of your comfort zone and network, because no matter what industry you're in, I truly believe that we're all doing marketing. And so you can be the best in your specific niche, but if nobody knows that, then what's the point?
Right.
And so networking is very, very important. As a matter of fact, I was networking at an event and I ran across a good friend of mine named Weston, and he invited me to a seminar to do with future entrepreneurs and the importance of tax documentation, your credit score, and how it looks buying a home. Well, that event went great. And so him and I, we had a conversation. We said, look, man, this information that we just shared, people need it. And so just with us having, one or two conversations, now we have it on the calendar to do first-time home buyer seminars in our local community. And he's an up-and-coming real estate agent that's really hitting the market really, really hot right now. Yeah. And so he's consistently, ranking up and doing tons of closings. But his biggest thing is educating his clientele. It's one thing as a real estate agent to just only seek a commission check, but it's a difference when you're looking and caring for someone. And so that's something where, we're super, super excited about. I think that's something that your audience would love. So I would definitely encourage you to reach out to that brother, man, because I think he's doing some real good things in our community.
Definitely will. Definitely will. I'd love to sit down with him and have a conversation and, dive deeper into what he's doing for the community.
Definitely.
That's our goal here. This podcast is called Truth and Legacy, and we always like to ask the last question. Mm-hmm. What is a legacy that you're building now or you're planning to build in the future for yourself and for your kids?
Yeah, I think you hit on the nail. I think my kids, becoming a father, becoming a husband has really changed me a lot in a positive way. And so, one thing we don't think about is, we're not here forever. And so what can we leave our kids if we happen, to leave this earth early? And so one thing my wife and I did is we opened up a life insurance policy. And so we have a policy where, God forbid, anything were to happen to us, our kids will get that policy. I'm not going to set a number on it, but it's a good situation for them, if anything were to happen. I found myself, investing in real estate. And so, we've got a rental property that we kept. We have our main primary resident. And so that investment property that we kept, we want to make sure we pay it off. And then we want to put it in our will for our kids. So small things like that is what we're doing early. I invested some money for my kids, my wife and I, for their college fund. Now, I'm an entrepreneur, but, I've got my bachelor's and my master's degree. And so I own my own business. So if my kids want to fall in line and follow my footsteps, that's great. If they want to go to college and have that college experience, then we'll have money for them as well. And so I'm not waiting for them to be 18, 19 years old, trying to figure out how we're going to pay for college. We're making those investments now. And so that's a long-term legacy that we're establishing now. And so, you want to do it when you're young. You don't want to look back, 15 years from now and try to do something that you could have done so many years ago.
Right.
And it goes back to my earlier point where if you're making that revenue in your business or you get a raise at your job, what seeds can you sow now, for your legacy, whether it's for you or for your kids?
Well, everyone, I thank you guys again for coming and just tuning in with us. Thank you, Rudy, again for bringing us to your space and having a conversation about this.
Yeah.
I hope everyone can get a little something from this and learn more about taxes. And you hustlers and you creatives, please do your taxes. If you need somebody, you have people around. Yeah, that's the wrap, guys. That's the wrap.
All right, man. Thanks for having me, man. Hey, good stuff.